We're all here to talk. Oh, yeah. Okay, I can't see it. Good to go? Good to go. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for being here with us and for joining us to admire my shoes. Before I introduce our guest, let me just put a couple of things in context. This is the fourth in a series of events that we have been having here at AEI on the Iraq War. And our aim in the events, and forgive me for those of you who have already heard me say this, and there are some of you in the room I see, nonetheless, the reason that we're doing this is because we want to talk about what happened in Iraq in context. There is a history of this war that has been written, that has become accepted wisdom, that is far from accurate. And while there are a lot of people with a lot of integrity who have written very well, the conventional wisdom, I would say, is not one that represents the decisions that the decisions that were made, how they were made, and why they were made at the time. And that's really why we're doing this series, to be followed by a small documentary and what I would call an Iraq War primer that we are putting together here in the Foreign and Defense Policy Department at AEI. We have talked about the years leading up to the war. We've talked about the decision to go to war, the conduct of the war, and the surge here in these events. And today we're going to talk about the period from the surge on. Roughly what I think about as the period during the Obama administration, which ushers, I think, us very nicely into the modern era. I hope that we are going to supplement our forgive me, I'm incoherent today. We are going to supplement our documentary with some additional interviews and some real-life Iraqis. There's a habit in Washington to talk about other people as if they don't really exist. And so I hope very much that we will have some Iraqis who have also had a lot of contemporaneous experiences and a lot of history to recount. I also, before I forget, will say one more word, which is that unfortunately my co-conspirator Gary Schmitt couldn't be here with us today because he's traveling, but this was very much a cooperative project on our part, and I'm sorry that Gary wasn't able to be with us. Now, enough housekeeping. Let me introduce our two guests, who I'm simply delighted to have with us. Joel Rayburn on my far right. Maybe.
That's a good place for Joel.
Good work. That puts me on the far left, Jim. Was the special advisor for Middle East Affairs, most recently to Senator Bill Haggerty, but is doing something I think much cooler and more important right now. But from 2018 to 2021, Joel was the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria. Until November 2020, he was also the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Levant Affairs in the State Department. Before that, he spent 26 years, and you don't hide it at all, serving as a U.S. Army officer with his final assignment as Senior Director for Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon on the National Security Council staff. He's also the founder and current director of the American Center for Levant Studies, which I think is a wonderful institution focused on something that deserves more attention in Washington than it gets even from the three of us devotees. He's a fellow both at the New American Foundation and at the Hoover Institution. In the middle, somewhere between us, possibly correctly, is Ambassador James Jeffrey. Ambassador Jeffrey served as the Secretary Special Representative for Syria engagement and the Special Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS until November of 2020. And you know why I have to read these, despite the fact that I know these two gentlemen extraordinarily well and for decades, because they have such august resumes. If I don't read it, I will leave something out, and then they will be mad at me afterwards. A little bit, maybe. This is Washington. Ambassador Jeffrey was formerly the Deputy National Security Advisor from 2007 to 2008, Also formerly the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Iraq, U.S. ambassador to Turkey, U.S. ambassador to Albania, and in 2010 he was appointed to the highest rank in the U.S. Foreign Service, the career ambassador, from 1969 to 1976, because apparently we are all Army here. Jim was a U.S. Army infantry officer with service in Germany and in Vietnam. He is the chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center until September of 2023. So are you going to be stepping down to be a fellow then?
No, I'm going to continue being the chair as far as I know. I hope so.
Maybe we found out something
Maybe,
online that
yeah,
you don't
who
know.
knows? Oh my God. Let me check my bank
Breaking
account.
news here.
We almost fired you before because of a typo, so I'm sorry to retire you. And was a distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute until 2018. Really thrilled to have you both here today. And I told both of our guests that Ryan Crocker, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who's probably one of the few people on the Foreign Service who can rival you for distinguished career ambassadors. He has served in every hellhole known to man. And enjoyed it all too much. And I'm sorry Ryan wasn't able to be with us, but I have the two of you and we're thrilled to have you. Let's talk a little bit about, and you asked me to start with Joel, so damn it, let's start with Joel. Let's talk a little bit about the period of time when Obama is running for office in 2008, because he's very clear. Despite the fact that the surge has been, I think by most accounts, a magnificent success. Despite the fact that the Sunni of Iraq have really turned on ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and they had been the ones who had welcomed them in, embraced them, and even been part of their efforts. Despite that fact, Barack Obama insisted that he would end this endless war. He did so in the context of some thinking about that, even in the Bush White House, that the United States might eventually pull out at the end of the decade. But what was going on at that time? Just read us in a little bit.
Well, on the ground in Iraq, the military campaign had achieved its operational objectives. Okay, that's which is to say, essentially, the fighting was over. It was effectively over. The warring parties in the field, so let's call it a Sunni insurgency, which was centered around Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which had renamed itself the Islamic State of Iraq by that point. So it's the proto-ISIS, had been operationally defeated. They were no longer able to pose a really, certainly, it couldn't pose an existential threat, couldn't hold territory and so on. The Shia militant groups that had been under the direction of Qasem Soleimani and the IRGC Quds Force had been broken by the campaign that centered around Basra in 2008, and that had proceeded through the rest of 2008. So the major fighting was over, and there was a point early in the surge, and 2006 was a nightmare year. You've already covered that. 2007, I was in Baghdad with General Petraeus and then Colonel McMaster, and there were days across Iraq. We used to track attacks. We got very into tracking the activity of the war. There were days where there would be 140, 150 attacks, so violent incidents of the war in a single day. By the time we got to the fall of 2008, it was not uncommon for the entire province of Anbar to have not a single attack recorded in a day, sometimes close to a week. And then we got to a couple of days as General Odierno took command from General Petraeus in the fall of 2008, where there were no attacks recorded across the entire country. And that, so there was a real lull in the fighting. And what came next was translating that into a political consolidation of what essentially was the end of the military conflict, or a respite, certainly a respite in the military conflict. The Sunni awakening, which had begun as a self-defense effort by Sunni communities against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Islamic State, began to take local power, consolidate. They became the local government in many places. That became clear in spades in early 2009 when the Iraqis held provincial government elections for the first time since 2005. And in all the Sunni provinces, the awakening had transformed itself from militias into political coalitions, and they swept into power in Anbar, in Mosul, in Tikrit, and it looked. And then they began organizing for what would be national elections a year later in 2010. So it really looked, both militarily and politically, the beginning of 2009 into 2008, beginning of 2009 was really auspicious. And it looked like we really would get to a political settlement to the overall conflict. And that's when the Obama administration came into office with already having made the decision to remove the essential element of holding that political settlement together, and that was the U.S. military. There was the magic of the surge wasn't just the U.S. troops on the ground, and it wasn't just the additional Iraqi troops on the ground, and it wasn't just the additional counterinsurgents in the awakening on the ground. It was that, strategically speaking, for the first time in the Iraq War, since the invasion, I think, we had aligned the political campaign, or the military campaign, with a political campaign, or a military strategy with a political strategy. We were doing military operations to achieve a particular political objective, which was to get the warring parties to stop fighting and translate from war to politics, to settle their differences and resolve them and come up with a settlement. But when the Obama administration decided immediately on coming in to set a withdrawal schedule of the U.S. military, and then begin pulling out brigades at the rate of about one a month, it wasn't lost on the Iraqis that the American military is leaving precisely at the time when the Iraqi communities that weren't militant, that weren't on the far fringes into militancy, had come to see us as sort of the broker or the guarantor of what would be a political settlement. So we were removing our military leverage that needed to underpin the political strategy right when it was needed most. And that's how 2000, I know you don't, you asked not to get too retrospective, but actually it was apparent at the time that we needed the military influence, the military position on the ground, in order to keep the political momentum going, but we were losing that military influence steadily month by month. And things began, over the course of 2009, they got shaky, and then into 2010.
So, and this will be a question that sounds familiar to those of you who watched our withdrawal from Afghanistan. One of the arguments that we heard at the time, and again, this is very much from the perspective of the moment, one of the arguments that we heard is, okay, the Iraqis, there's no longer a viceroy there. The Iraqis have had their own elections. The Iraqis have had national elections. They've had regional elections. Those came off quite successfully. We had been training the military. They had been working with us in brigade forms, and side by side, we had invested a lot of money in them. And I think what was the phrase that President Bush liked so much? We'll stand down when they stand up, or some such. It's been a long time since I remembered that quote. But I think that was one of the ideas that animated the thinking in Washington, was it not?
Well, it absolutely was. But there was, I think, there was a more negative thesis as well, which is that which came from 2004, 5, 6, was the idea that actually the presence of U.S. troops created or exacerbated the conflict. And there were some people, especially some who came into or advised the new Obama administration, that U.S. troops' presence made it worse, and that actually our presence, and because we're the Army as well, we're overbearing, that by being there, we stood in the way. We became an obstacle to the Iraqis natural inclination to get along, or natural inclination that we made it less possible for the Iraqis to just get together and do the deals that they would to create a settlement. But which was the opposite was true, in fact, because at that state, I mean, the Iraqis have been through a 5-year civil war, and the trust among the political class of the various Iraqi communities was shattered. And in order for them to take the risks that they needed to take to get to a political settlement, they needed us to be there to guarantee that these other communities wouldn't turn on them and gobble them up, for example. And as we began to leave, you know, they began to get more wary, all of them, all the different parties, all the different communities.
So enter Jim Jeffrey, who comes in as ambassador in 2010. And how was it?
Everything Joel said, with one extraordinarily important exception, is absolutely correct. And I came into a situation where it was almost embarrassing for the Obama administration because the good war was not going all that well. Afghanistan, you'll all remember the surge and then the unsurge announced the same day. And whereas Iraq, as Joel had pointed out, was actually pretty quiet. You had a democratic system. For those of us who remember the Iraq we so loved in 2004, 2005, in the middle of total chaos, you had a functioning government, albeit not a particularly well-functioning government. So all in all, it was almost successful. And he was well aware that he was, by the time I got out there in 2010, that he would be running for election in 2 more years, and he didn't want to go through a who lost Iraq syndrome. Now, the difference is, and this is truly important, is it wasn't Obama's idea to withdraw the troops. Whose idea was it to withdraw the troops? Anybody want to venture a guess here? It was George Bush's idea to withdraw the troops. And while I normally left Doug Lute, I didn't leave, Hadley left, had me do everything but Iraq, and Doug Lute did Iraq and Afghanistan. But the week where it got crucial at the very end of 2008 on what we euphemistically call, even Obama called it in his Camp Lejeune state, the Status of Forces Agreement, but the actual official title was, what is it, Joe? Something like Withdrawal of American Troops from Iraq Agreement, I believe. It was sort of insulting, and it was one of the many reasons why, aside from the lawyers, the American military hated it. But George Bush, and I was, as they say, or as Bolton says, present in the room, when the decision was made, Bush said, we're going to go and do this. And so we signed up as part of the status, what we call the Status of Forces Agreement, an agreement that all U.S. troops would leave by the end of 2011.
Okay, why?
Here's the reason why, I think. First of all, because George Bush and the people who were advising him at that time, with the exception of Dick Cheney, very much felt that we were overengaged militarily in the region. Therefore, on a variety of things, from the bombing of the Al-Qaeda nuclear site in Syria in 2007 to the cool reaction to the Israeli response in Lebanon in 2006 and to various Iranian actions, we were on a let's not have any problems trend in the Bush administration. But there was another reason for that, and that was a legal one. Every year, from 2004 on, our military presence and essentially the legal status of our troops was based upon a UN Security Council resolution. And it was renewed every year, and it was renewed only when the Iraqis would send a note to the UN and say, yes, please allow the United States to continue essentially running our sovereignty for us.
And an AUMF from Congress.
Right. But the
That's
key
still
thing,
enforced
under
today.
international law, the key thing was the UN resolution. And the Iraqis, as part of the whole set of things at the end of the Bush administration, and I wasn't involved in the background to that, but I do know that they did say to the UN, we're not going to send these letters anymore. And that meant that if we wanted to keep troops on beyond 2008, we needed to negotiate, just like we do with other countries, a Status of Forces Agreement. Well, the problem is that unlike all of our pals in the Middle East and places like Egypt and Jordan, where we just sit in the back corner with the king or the prince or the president's advisor, we actually had to get an agreement through Parliament because it granted legal immunity for U.S. troops, which was the whole point of a status of forces agreement. And to do that, Parliament would have to vote on it. It was the assessment, and I think correct, of the White House that that would not happen without an end date for the American presence. So they signed up for 2011, end of 2011. By that time, they thought that things would be in far better shape. And also, and I've heard this from many senior Bush administration officials later, I didn't hear it at the time, and I've never quite heard it from Iraqis. It was the idea of, but after we get reelected or John McCain gets elected, we're going to come back and change this. But be it as it was, that was the agreement that was made in December of 2008. Obama came in and he endorsed this in what was called the Camp Lejeune speech in early 2009 on Iraq, saying, okay, the time is over. The important decisions that have to be made about Iraq's future must now be made by Iraqis. We are going to push for a sovereign, stable, and self-reliant Iraq. But he literally said, what we cannot do is let the pursuit of the perfect stand in the way of achievable goals. We cannot rid Iraq of all of its problems, et cetera, ourselves. It's up to them now. So under the Status of Forces Agreement, I intend to remove all U.S. troops from Iraq by the end of 2011. So he essentially adopted the Bush administration policy. The interesting thing is, as soon as myself and General Austin got out there in 2010, we looked around and said, this isn't going to make any sense. We need to keep the troops on. And thus, most of our struggle for the next year and a half was to, first of all, persuade the Obama administration, where we succeeded to some degree, in trying to keep the troops on, and then trying to persuade the Iraqis to keep the troops on too. That failed in the end, and thus they wound up leaving by the end of December in 2011. And the lessons from that particular episode tell us a lot about the Iraq we were dealing with and how the United States responded to it.
So this rigid set of ideas, both from the latter days of the Bush administration and then from the opening days of the Obama administration, really governed what our policy was, rather than a read of the situation on the ground.
No, the read of the situation on the ground, I think, was correct. I don't think the Iraqi parliament would have endorsed unlimited American status of forces agreement. I think they wanted an end date. I think they were also, and in the end, I believe they would have gone along with a non-legally binding agreement. Maliki offered that to us. We turned it down. He offered it again to us in 2014 after a third of the country had collapsed, and we took it, and I think we were right in 2014, and we were also right in turning it down when everything was peaceful and such in 2011.
Joel had a finger up.
Well, I think, so the mistake that the Obama administration made in implementing the policy decision that the Bush administration had made to set a date certain for withdrawal was, the mistake they made didn't have to do with the end date of the withdrawal. It had to do with the start date of the withdrawal and the rate at which and the timetable under which they conducted the withdrawal, which was completely detached until Ambassador Jeffrey got there from political events on the ground. And so that's where I say the political strategy was decoupled from the military strategy was decoupled from the political strategy. There was an almost 3-year period between Obama's inauguration and the date for withdrawal. No one said, there was no compelling reason to go ahead and begin withdrawing right at the beginning of the Obama administration, and to continue the withdrawal on the same timetable, at the same pace, while the Iraqis were having a national election for a new government, and then obviously struggling to come up with a stable governing coalition after, as they were waving bye-bye to 1 U.S. brigade a month while they were doing that. Jim is right. Jim was inside that decision in 2008. He's 100% correct about the thinking behind it, but the implementation was done almost on autopilot and detached from conditions on the ground. As there was a resurgent Iranian threat, as there was a resurgent Al-Qaeda in Iraq / Islamic State threat, as the regional situation was becoming highly unstable with the onset of the Arab Spring as well as Iranian intervention in places around the region. And so that's why I say it was the decoupling that was the strategic error.
Yeah, I would just say, see, we are going to have a discussion about this, and
there you
I'm
go.
finding myself being forced, which was the last thing I imagined, defending Barack Obama's Iraq policy. So I'm going to, believe me, I'm going to attack it in a second, so bear with me here. Essentially, and I would like to claim credit for it, but I think the decision was made before I got out there, but it was announced right about that time, that we would halt the withdrawal at 50,000, and we would make no further withdrawals from mid-2010 until we saw what was going to happen, which was very helpful to us in our plotting to turn the administration around on the decision to pull out, which we succeeded in doing at a National Security Council meeting in January of 2011. The problem with the Obama administration's execution of this was, it was on one hand yes, on the other hand no. I have to, as the ambassador, I never, including some very difficult decisions, never got a no from Obama on anything I pressed for, including the pretty wild one of trying to keep troops on. But I never got an enthusiastic yes. I just got a yes, but it was, so we kept the troops on at 50,000, but we renamed them. Ken Pollard knows this whole history. We renamed them from combat brigades, which they were, without changing it to train and equip brigades. And this is unfair to say because people were hurt. I was almost delighted to see that the enemy decided that they had a voice in that. So the day Joe Biden came out to announce this publicly, they shelled the hell out of us at the embassy, including bracketing Biden's quarters, but of which he has mentioned many times since then. The administration, as I said, I think partially for electoral reasons, partially because there were strong supporters. I mean, I can name some of the people who were advising Obama who thought exactly the way Joel did, but I have to say Secretary Gates, Secretary Clinton, and Tom Donilon, the National Security Advisor, were all supportive of keeping troops on. They were all nervous about a withdrawal. Joe Biden, who had the Iraq portfolio, was less enthused than that team. Panetta was also as strong as Gates. But he was more enthused than Barack Obama. So you were spending a lot of time out in Baghdad kind of with a Zen whatever diagram of the various senior players in the administration, but that's not unusual for anybody in the field and something as important as that. So you had an unenthusiastic effort to try to stay on. The Iraqis sensed that. And there I would go back to agree to some degree with Joel. Whatever chances we had of getting the Iraqis to an agreement, or them to maybe providing a little bit more than just a note signed by Maliki on the back of a piece of paper to a parliamentary vote, anything creative was kind of undercut by all kinds of conflicting messages they got out of Washington. And I'll name names because Ben Rhodes deserves a special award for having undercut his own president's decisions at every time he could get in front of a mic.
Yeah, we could have a whole event on that.
Yeah, okay.
And I would enjoy
So
speaking
am I
at
harsh
it.
enough on the Obama administration now?
Yes, yes, but the Iraqis have agency as well, right? And perhaps with, let's say gently, with some of our help and some perhaps bad choices and bad taste on the part of various people in Washington, there were people in power in Iraq who were all too happy to go along with seeing back the Americans.
The what are the Americans?
So saying goodbye to the Americans.
They were Sadr. Nobody else, not even Maliki. That's my belief.
No, well, you're
They
nice.
didn't want
You're-
us.
I think you're too nice, but
They
that might just be
didn't
me.
want to sign up for that in Parliament where they could be voted in. We also had a campaign. The Iranians were not only starting to, through their surrogates, hit our bases, they were also executing people. We found lots of folks assassinated by .22 caliber pistols, which is the usual professional assassination route for anybody who's good. And so people were afraid. And again, we gave them lots of reasons to think that we weren't fully serious about this.
Yeah.
And there's echoes in the decades since then. But so, Joel, talk a little bit about the Iraqi side. You said that our military and our political strategies became completely disconnected. But what was going on politically at the time? Yes, the Iranians were certainly back, but there were things going on among the Iraqis as well.
Yes, I mentioned that the awakening groups took local political power at the beginning of 2009. What happened next, and that was, in addition, even in the South, the coalition, which was majority Sunni but headed by Ayad Alawi, emerged as a major danger to Nuri Maliki's political bloc from those provincial elections. And immediately, Maliki spent 2009 preparing for the national elections that would come a year later, a little over a year later, and by trying to break Ayad Alawi's following in the south and in Baghdad, and by trying to break the awakening, especially in places outside of Anbar and Mosul. And so what we saw in 2009, and this is even as, remember that what became ISIS was not dead yet. They're only mostly dead. You know, I mean, they were still there and trying to reconstitute. And they were doing that with Syrian regime help and so on. That Maliki began directing, and more across 2009, Maliki began directing especially the counterterrorism forces against political enemies, as opposed to against the regenerating or the attempting to regenerate Al-Qaeda / Islamic State network. And so he was. It was a very politicized use of the Iraqi military and the Iraqi gendarmerie at the time. That began to turn he succeeded ultimately in alienating again the awakening. And as each of these awakening leaders are rounded up, the argument goes on in the Sunni community. Okay, Maliki is now using the security forces against the awakening leaders, particular awakening leaders. What happens to the constituency for those awakening leaders? Now, the more radical voices can say, well, you see, the awakening didn't protect you. Those guys are gone. Now you got to turn back to us. You got to turn back to you got to turn back to the Islamic State in Iraq, militancy, and so on. And then by the late summer and fall of 2009, then came the really destabilizing, massive car bomb attacks that hit the Iraqi ministries in Baghdad, and that was sort of that was the sign that those networks were coming back, and that Maliki had been focused on the wrong enemies because he was using them for political purposes.
And what happens? What happens when Washington sees this? Why at this point do we not realize that this victory, and what you described in Iraq was victory. That's what victory looks like. That this victory was being snatched.
Several reasons. First of all, I would not consider the turning point in that regard. There was some of this all along, but the serious turning point and the real problem we started really getting, where people were calling us all of the time, was after the troops left, in fact, actually just before the decision was made, when Maliki went to Washington to talk about the post-troop presence in December. On the way back, he ordered the Iraqi Vice President Tariq Hashemi, who was the head of the Iraqi Islamic Policy, which was the Muslim Brotherhood faction, and well known among Sunni Arabs, arrested for terrorism. Then Maliki let him escape to the north, where he stayed for a long time and eventually went to Turkey. But this was, and that was also, we were having some problems getting the Iraqi government's payments to the Awakening, and those problems increased. We also saw more pressure. So I would say it was an upward trend until those developments. Nobody, including I, thought this was a serious problem. It was just one of the 50 problems we had. And again, we had Barack Obama's, and I'm defending Barack Obama in this statement. What we will not do is let the pursuit of the perfect stand in the way of achievable goals. We cannot rid Iraq of all who oppose America or sympathize with our adversaries. We cannot police Iraq's streets until they are completely safe, nor stay until Iraq's union is perfected. We were dealing with a very imperfect union. We were dealing with some unsafe streets. But all in all, particularly for those of us who had been there half a decade before, this was a huge, dramatically different country, and that was thanks both to Iraqis, first of all, but then also to our efforts.
Okay, so how do we go from that, okay, not perfect, not even good, some troubling straws in the wind, to the Islamic State taking over a swath of the region, with its base coming out of Iraq?
It was a troop withdrawal. It did many things. One thing it did was it made Maliki less secure. Maliki, like most of the Shia leaders, had this incredible fear of the Baathists coming back. And in fact, their fear of the Baathists coming back was a major contributor to the Baathists in the form of the Islamic State coming back. So they basically fed their own fears. As long as they were U.S. troops, Maliki had a safety valve. He had a security blanket, and he used this repeatedly. He, at least once in my presence, asked Austin to move troops back into the cities because as part of the 2008 deal, at one point they were going to leave the cities, and they did with a few exceptions. Because we had, during the outbreak of the Arab Spring, we had the al-Qaeda folks blow up the Beiji refinery and do various other things. So Maliki got all nervous and he wanted the U.S. troops to come back in, and we found other ways to help him out. But even after, repeatedly after the troops left, Maliki came back and said, hey, can we have this asset? Can we have that asset? Can you bring some guys back in to do this and that? Because he was nervous, including at the Arab Summit in early 2012. He was very freaked out by the fact that there was nobody other than his own military forces to protect him from the Baathists and the terrorists and whatever the Syrians were doing and such. And he didn't have a whole lot of faith in them. And then, of course, he reacted by getting rid of all of the good leaders and replacing them with sycophants who performed just as we predicted they would in Mosul in 2014. So it made the whole situation worse once troops were out.
I want to come back to Joel and talk about the situation in the region and how Iraq metastasizes. Coincident, we should be fair with with the Arab Spring destabilizing other countries as well. But I want to ask you one question, Jim, because you were there. It wasn't just that we pulled the troops out, because Bush said we should, much as we pulled out of Afghanistan because Trump said we should. It was that we ceased intelligence cooperation with them, that we ceased providing intelligence for them, we ceased providing them access to overhead. We didn't just pull out, we cut them off cold. I don't understand that. You say we didn't?
We did absolutely nothing. When we still thought we were going to pull the troops out, right after I came in there, I sat down and worked with the U.S. military on what we would do after they left. And we had a $20 billion FMS program for hundreds of Abrams tanks, for
foreign military sales.
Yeah, F-16s, and just all kinds of things. We were going to keep thousands of U.S. Boeing and General Dynamics and other contractors on. We were going to keep this huge military mission under the embassy on legal diplomatic terms, under a 3-star general, And we were going to have whites off, the normal special forces out there advising folks. We were going to have blacks off who were working under various very highly classified arrangements. We were going to keep Coast Guard vessels protecting the offshore terminals because that wasn't in Iraqi waters, so we didn't need a status of forces. We had a whole plan. The first thing we did was we shelved the plan. Why did we shelf the plan? Because we knew as soon as that thing appeared in Washington, any chance of us trying to get troops on. In fact, when Barack Obama announced his ill-fated 2014 withdrawal of the last 10,000 troops from Afghanistan, he cited, and we're going to have an arrangement like the one we have in Iraq afterwards. So he knew all about this because once it was sure that we couldn't keep troops on, in December, the same ill-fated Maliki trip, we briefed Obama extensively on what we were going to do. It was all kinds of intelligence cooperation. As I said, Special Forces, $1 billion police training program under State Department's INL. We were picking up all kinds of things. What happened was a conspiracy between the State Department for resource regions, the U.S. military for resource and other reasons, and the Iraqis that undercut most of this very quickly. Now, a lot of it still stayed. We still kept a huge advisory mission. The FMS program continued. We still kept all of these, what used to be American military FOBs. They were now inside Iraqi bases, but there were these thousands of contractors with teams of American military who looked just like the military used to be there, except they were under the chief of mission, i.e. ambassador's authority, not under the commander. And I've thought a lot about this because this was a major failing and it contributed to the collapse of the Iraqi army. First of all, the State Department looked at what we were doing, and it was officially 16,000 people at the embassy, but it was really 18,000, but I was terrified to tell people we were over our limits. It was 10% of the State Department's entire budget, $6 billion. And it was going that way forever because despite what Barack Obama said about, I keep quoting him here, what we will not do is let the pursuit of the perfect stand in the way of achievable goals. Folks, when it comes to this city, I would say even today, but certainly in 2010, 11, 12, looking at our pet rock partner countries, we can't let go of this. There's a huge bureaucracy, there was huge belief systems and everything that we could turn this country into Denmark if we tried hard enough. And we have been chugging away at this since we went in 2003 with a vengeance after we had a huge program with the embassy in 2004 onward. We'd seen success, nobody wanted to let it go. So we were putting all of this in, and suddenly after we no longer had troops, people were saying that they were waking up to the reality of that the main reason we're having those troops, that we're having all this civilian effort trying to turn this country into Denmark, was that was the military's exit strategy. You know, go read the, you know, Petraeus, Mattis, what is it, 23-4 or 24-3, I always get it wrong. What was the manual, the counterinsurgency manual? The whole phase 4. Clear, build, hold. We were the hold guys, and suddenly people lost interest in that, again, when there was no longer a rationale for providing an exit for the military, because the military had already exited. So I started losing State Department support. But the main thing was we were we're running into problems with the Iraqis because all of these things we were doing were intruding, just like we had done before, into their sovereignty in various ways. We had our intelligence people, our special forces, our various agencies burrowing deep into all their security forces. They were willing to do that when they had a real no-shit threat, as we saw again in 2014, and when they had tens of thousands of American troops to come to their rescue. But when they didn't have tens of thousands of American troops to come to their rescue and the threat had seemingly been minimized, they didn't like this. So Maliki started pulling back on things, his support, asking us, and some of this was under Iranian pressure, of course. We didn't like American folks dealing with some of the same people they were dealing with. So we were pressure from that account. We got pressure from the State Department to start with reducing programs, cutting costs, closing places like we had an installation up in Kirkuk that we eventually had to close. But then the last thing was, and the most important, as long as you had a 4-star general who was in a video conference once a week with the Secretary of Defense and a couple of times a month with the President of the United States, nobody wanted to mess with a major American project. Once you try to return that to normal and still maintain that kind of interest, commitment, political risk-taking on the part of Washington and huge resources, again, $6 billion a year, you don't have the interest. The troops being there on top of everything else they did forced Washington to take Iraq seriously because they had to find a way to get the troops out. But once you withdraw the troops, I mean, this sounds like counterintuitive reasoning. Once the troops are gone, all of the other stuff you're doing doesn't seem all that important. The troops generate their own motive for an American commitment, ironically.
Well, we learned that lesson, PDQ. So, Joel, talk a little bit about the situation on the ground that we see. So Jim has given us a picture of the dynamic and the decision-making and the waffling and the backtracking that's happening in Washington, and that's mirrored to a certain extent by Nouri al-Maliki. What happens in the region at the time?
Well, first of all, can I touch though on what happened on the ground here in
You can touch
Washington?
whatever you want.
Is that you know, at the outset of the Bush administration, the defense transformation advocates thought that moving into the 21st century, that ground forces were passé, that ground wars were passé, that there was going to be information dominance and so on and so forth, and also that needed to be aimed at the Pacific. So there was an idea at the beginning, and Secretary Rumsfeld, I think, advocated this and started to execute it, was to really reduce the size, budget, and strategic role of the Army in particular, but also as a consequence the Marines, in favor of projecting in the air and maritime and cyber domains. And the Iraq War interrupted that. Mm-hmm. And so throughout the Iraq War, institutionally, there were a lot of people in the Pentagon and bureaucratic interests in the Pentagon who said, we need to hurry up and wind this thing down so we can get back to reducing the Army and the ground forces to our land power to its proper size. The Army needs to have an end strength that begins with a 3, for example, and a much smaller budget. And the longer that the Iraq engagement dragged on, it postponed getting back to right-sizing the different strategic arms of the Defense Department. And for that matter, the Afghanistan campaign was a distraction as well. So there was a real bureaucratic impetus to just get the troops out of Iraq, and then after that, get the troops out of Afghanistan. In addition to that, by 2009, the bandwagon in the Pentagon had moved on to South Asia. Iraq, the Pentagon...
the good war.
Right. Well, not just the good war, but also, it was closer to the real theater, which was the Pacific and so on.
The war that was not the war of choice.
That's right.
That was the great debate
the war
going on at the time.
That's right. Mm-hmm. So, institutionally in the Pentagon and in CENTCOM and everywhere else, it was all about AFPAC and, Iraq. What are we still doing there? And so there was that. Now, I thought the situation in 2009 and 10, though regionally and in Iraq's different regions, I thought it was very dangerous. And I was just a staff officer. No one cared what I thought. But I thought I saw signs of real potential disintegration, especially as you moved into, there was a long interregnum, and Jim had to suffer through months of that. Between the Iraqi elections took place in March, and they didn't form a government until December. So there was a political vacuum for most of 2010. In fact, I think it was the longest parliamentary interregnum in modern history between an election and actually forming a government. And
much of it is pushed by Jim deliberately to try to avoid
a bad outcome. That's right. That's right. Right. So the guy who lost the election, and he got 89 seats, I think, and Ayatollah Alawi got 92 or 93.
91.
And 91. Right. It's 91 to 89. after Maliki had gone in expecting 120. And so the guy lost the election, but still
weirdly
still
became
held on
prime
to power.
minister.
Sorry? Yeah, that's right.
I wonder how that happened.
So, well, Jim could tell you chapter and verse. But in addition to that, it was very clear in 2009, and then through that horrible vacuum of 2010, that Qasem Soleimani was working as hard as he could to undo everything we had accomplished in the surge, and to make sure that the political gains that we could get consolidated in Iraq would be his and not ours. At the same time so Syria was beginning to disintegrate, and it was absolute free space after a while. You know, Bashar al-Assad let the Islamic State out of prison, several thousand people who became leaders and operatives in ISIS. He deliberately let out of his jails so they would go and pollute the rebellion against him, and they ran amok. And they were able to use northern and eastern Syria as a base then to launch back into the old battlefields in Anbar and Nineveh and Salahuddin in particular. There was a moment, I think it was, Ken may be able to remind, I think April 2011, when there was a Mumbai-style attack against the Tikrit government building that killed 50-something people. And that was sort of the announcement by what became ISIS. We are back, and we can do this. We can reach into a Sunni city, and we can annihilate the government. And they did that just a little over a year, or not less than a year since the decapitation of the Al Qaeda leadership out near Lake Tharthar. So they were announcing that they're back, and they were coming back. By the time you got to the end of 2011 on into early 2012, they were beginning to reach into Anbar. They were always reaching into Mosul. And at the end of 2012, remember, what became ISIS seized control of Fallujah. So it was already back by then.
No, that was the beginning of 2014.
No, 13. 12 to 13. It was Christmas 12, yeah. It was when Al-Wani, remember when
We're gonna
Maliki,
put this fight later.
in December 2012, when Maliki had the counterterrorism forces go and arrest Ahmed Al-Wani,
The brother of the member of
who was the last,
January
one of the,
2014.
Can we fight this out off
it was
camera
December
afterwards?
2012. Ken will confirm. So even by the beginning of 2013, ISIS was back challenging for control in Anbar, and they were challenging for control in Tel Afar, and the thing was starting to come apart. And then fast forward to 2013, to the summer of 2013. Anyway, so I personally I thought the warning signs were there, and we were after Jim left, we were somewhat asleep at the switch.
We saw the warning signs, but we didn't know what to do about it because, as I said, we were faced with constant pressure from Maliki one day, from the State Department the next day, and from elements of the U.S. military. We had to go to Obama. Again, Obama backed us, myself and General Caslin, our military chief, against the entire Pentagon in December of 2011 because the Pentagon lawyers wanted to pull all of our military teams, who were technically under us, but really under Caslin, out of all of these former FOBs, I'll call them, bases, where we had thousands of these military contractors from Lockheed and everybody else. And believe me, those military troops left, these guys would have been gone the next day. Absolutely. And so again, it was pressure from everybody.
So let's jump forward. We know what happened, right? ISIS comes back. ISIS exploits the instability not simply in the region, but also inside Iraq and the rat lines that are coming through Syria to dominate a very substantial portion, not just of Iraq, but also of other countries in the Middle East. And there's a decision made to go back. This is an admission of failure, not admitted out loud, but this was a failure. What happens?
I think Barack Obama, where he say no, the Iraqis failed. He said, we gave them back their country, we beat down all of the opposition, they allowed themselves, and there's a certain argument for this.
Is that right?
Yeah, to some degree. Everybody in Iraq knew that. Maliki's own demons and the increasing Iranian control through not only the Bada Corps, Hadi al-Amri, but increasingly the former terrorists from Asa al-Haq and the Hezbollah folks who were coming more into the political system, was going to make it impossible for the Sunni Arabs and eventually even the Kurds to really have a legitimate role inside their own country, which is where I think we are right now in 2022. And that falls on not just, it's a little bit like Lebanon. Who lost Lebanon? We know who won it. We know who was pushing to win it for many years, the Iranians. And in the case of Iraq, it was the Iranians plus the Islamic State people, Al-Qaeda people. But again, the argument that I think Obama would have made was, hey, this is why we're in these conflicts for whole decades. These people cannot get their stuff together. And therefore, we have to keep on going back in. As we all know, he went in only very, very reluctantly in 2014, and I was involved. Joel and many of us were involved in one way or the other, watching what was going on, people asking us and such. And they were very, very reluctant to go back in. And they went in only in a little toe, then a bigger toe. Remember, for a while, it wasn't even defeat ISIS. It was, what, degrade ISIS? That was the official mission of the U.S. government, huh? Degrade ISIS? What's that mean? And finally, we got ever more aggressive late 2015, and then in the Trump administration, as Joel can attest to, we got much more aggressive. But we, so I think that the argument is, hey, let's put, again, that's the logic of his Camp Lejeune speech, let's put the responsibility on these guys. They got it, they blew it, they let Maliki run the country. As somebody who, as I said, was trying very hard to find anybody but Maliki, I have to say, Iyad Alawi was his own worst enemy in the various schemes that we came up with, and he was, the competitor with that was Masoud Barzani, and the proximate cause of Maliki becoming prime minister was one day Barzani told me, hey, I've just talked to Maliki, Jim, just stop, we've already worked our deal.
Well, I've known these guys for many decades, and yes, none of that surprises me in the least. I want to get to the audience and questions, and I'm sorry. Some of this may, as you listen to it, may sound like, my God, these guys, they're in the weeds. But
Which is true.
Well, we are.
But that is what factors into every single decision that gets made. That's why the bumper sticker, right? Bush lied, people died, we ruined Iraq, blah, blah, blah. You all know how I feel about that. But at the end of the day, this is the problem. There are all these countervailing forces that are at work that mean that any simple explanation doesn't work. So I want to get quickly to, we're still in Iraq today. Maliki is still vying for power today. The Iranians, thank God Qasem Soleimani is dead, but the Iranians are still hard at work through their proxies. Joel, what happens? We come in, we help push it back, and then what?
Well, in 2014, as ISIS was sweeping into Sunni cities, there was a very fateful step that Grand Ayatollah Sistani took, which was to endorse the formation of militias, the popular mobilization forces, to go and fight in place of the army, really. Supposedly alongside the army, but really, he gave a religious blessing to the formation of an alternate army. And Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mati al-Muhandis and Hadi al-Amri and a bunch of other nefarious characters leapt into that and used it to create what is now the monster that dominates certainly Baghdad and the south of the Popular Mobilization Forces, which are, a shadow army that responds to the IRGC.
This is actually when Iraq becomes Lebanon in my
Yeah,
in my
it
view.
was.
It is
That's
the
right.
moment.
As Ryan Crocker would say, that was a key element in the Lebanonization of Iraq. We didn't do much to push back on that. In fact, I was on the ground, as Ken was in 2015, and there were voices on the U.S. side in D.C. and in Baghdad saying, well, we should work with these guys because we have a shared enemy of ISIS. We did work with them. I mean, not to the extent that some people were advocating, but there were people coming up with fantastical schemes to start training these people. That the U.S. military would train essentially a Quds Force proxy. I don't know if they would have suffered to have been trained, but there were people who wanted to do it, and that became irreversible. Now those guys have a budget that the Iraqi state gives them more than $2 billion a year, which is essentially just a subsidy for the Quds Force budget in Iraq. They've also, since the death of Soleimani and Abu Mehdi al-Mohandes, the Iranians have also resorted to lawfare inside Iraq. So the chief judge of the Iraqis' top court is continually making rulings nullifying key elements of political stability in Iraq. So doing things like issuing a ruling saying it's illegal for the KRG, the Kurdistan region, to export oil on its own. Recently, we made a ruling saying, well, actually, the Kurdistan Regional Government's parliament is illegal. It's unconstitutional, and so on. The guy travels around. His name is Judge Faik Saeed. He travels around like he's the president of Iraq, like he's the head of government of Iraq. He goes to Tehran. He goes to Damascus and sits down with Bashar al-Assad and things like that. So the Iranians are projecting a lot of power in Iraq still these days. But it stems from them being able to use the counter-ISIS campaign as cover for their political consolidation in the south and in Baghdad, as well as other places now. But they did that one of the reasons they were able to do that effectively, and it had such a knock-on effect across Iraq, was that Maliki did his best to use the power of the state to destroy the Sunni political center, which I could shorthand as bumper sticker as the awakening. It was others too, but 2010, for 3 successive Christmases, Maliki arrested the most popular Sunni leader in Iraq. Mm-hmm. In 2010, he arrested Tariq Hashemi. And there were people on the American side who said, Hashemi, good riddance. He's hard to deal with. Yeah, but he got 250,000 votes. What about his constituency? Where do they go now? 2011, he arrested Rafael Assawi, who was the leading voice of Anbar. What happens to the several 100,000 people who looked to him as their community leader? And then in 2012, Ahmed Al-Wani, who was more of a firebrand and distasteful, but again, he was what passed for he was not quite moderate, but by that you can see the degradation. But this was a signal for several years to the Sunni community that Nuri Maliki and the Shia Islamist political parties, we will choose your Sunni leaders for you. We will impose on doing things like bringing back the absolute scumbag Mishan Jabouri, who had been a bagman for Uday Hussein, to bring him back, forgive his terrorism charges, bring him back from Damascus and Libya, where he was working for Gaddafi, and prop him up as a Maliki-sponsored challenger to the awakening in northern Iraq. That's what Maliki did. So he helped to create the Sunni political vacuum that ISIS just roared into in 2013 and 14.
I'll give you a general and then a specific
We'll go to
one.
questions.
In a nutshell, and of course I'm borrowing a line from A Few Good Men, we can't deal with the truth. The truth is, by our extraordinary power, which 2023, look at a recent Economist thing, actually continues surging ahead economically, technologically, and obviously militarily. And our geography, look at the oceans, means that we always have an isolationist option, and a population in history that pushes us away from playing a huge role in international affairs. Yet, for now, the better part of a century plus, we have been playing the major role in international affairs, but it's an unnatural act, and we're not good at it. When it gets really clear, best example is World War II, but Ukraine and to some degree Taiwan are close enough to that to be sort of black and white, we kind of can function. When it is in this, messy world of influencing, 80 or 90 states who are our partners 80% of the time and 20% of the time are talking with the enemy, or our friends like Israel against Iran, but not so much against Russia, and India against China, but not so much against Russia. We have a hard time doing this. So the details that Joel and I are all talking about, I've been watching flow from places from Vietnam to Central America for the last 50 years, and I'm not surprised at anything I've seen. But nonetheless, in terms of the details, it was two things in looking at this whole period. One is the Obama administration, as deliberate policy, and the Bush administration, because of exhaustion, were not able to really recognize what a terrible threat Iran is to the region in the long term. And two, in terms of 2014, the whole idea of responding to the Islamic State challenge, which was Al-Qaeda in another nutshell, that's the wrong analogy, Al-Qaeda in another form, and just required what has been an extremely successful low-cost, low-casualty military operation since 2014, when we finally did that, until today, was because we looked at any problem in the Middle East and we said, nation building and hundreds of thousands of troops, we're not going there. And so these two reactions have produced a whole variety of really stupid decisions. Sorry.
I think you summed up American foreign policy extraordinarily.
In the Middle East, we're doing better in Asia and Europe, okay?
I think many of our colleagues would disagree that we're doing better in those places as well. Let's open things up for questions. As usual, first of all, I can't see you if I have my glasses on. We also have questions open to those who are watching online. I've got this little iPad next to me, so I look like my mother. And on the screen, you can see to whom to submit the questions. And because I've been looking at Ken and rolling my eyes the entire time, oh my God, I remember when that happened. Let's turn to Ken, and then I see the gentleman over here for sure. And please do identify yourself and put your statement in the form of a question. Sure. Oh, wait, you lost Ken. Wait, 1 second. Would you mind, Ken has the microphone, and then we turn to you? Forgive me. I was showing a home team prejudice here, but I haven't forgotten you.
I'm Ken Pollack. I'm a senior fellow at AEI, and as you've all heard, a veteran of the Iraq Wars. First, the panel is terrific, as they all are. Thank you so much for doing this. Great to see you both and get all your insights. I want to ask you about another moment in time when we had yet another opportunity and we once again blew it, which was the ISIS war, the Daesh war, right? I mean, I think that you guys are absolutely correct. That is when the PMF comes in. That is when Soleimani really is able to run the table on us. But there was a chance there. There was an opportunity to go in the other direction, right? From my perspective, one of the biggest mistakes we made during that whole enterprise was we turned it into a purely military operation. The political and economic pieces kind of went out the window, right? And again, Jim, I can remember being at some meetings with you early on. Joel, obviously, yes, I was there briefly on the ground with you. You stayed. What was your sense of what happened there? I mean, there were all these plans for we were going to do all these different things politically with the Iraqis, all these different things economically with the Iraqis that just kind of fell away over the course of time. And the only thing that continued to march on soundly were those military lines of effort. So would love to hear what happened, your sense of what happened here in Washington that kind of caused the Obama administration to just lose interest in the political and economic efforts that were always supposed to underpin the military and allow us to translate a military victory into something more meaningful.
That's a good question. It was a deliberate action or decision, deliberate decision, not to not have a economic, political, diplomatic, financial, and propaganda side to this thing. As you know, the Coalition Office and the State Department and their counterparts in defense set up all of these lines of effort, and they're actually 80 nations. It was actually, from a tradecraft point of view, it worked very well, which is why this campaign has worked very well. But this campaign was seen as a military campaign to defeat ISIS. And it more or less has succeeded, other than in the Assad areas where they're still alive and well, but that's not something we can deal with through that campaign. That requires an overall Syria policy, and don't get me on that. And the reason was, Ken, it was deliberate. I think that the last thing the Obama administration wanted, but I would say more generally, the last thing almost everybody in America, other than all of us who attend meetings like this, so spend our time doing these things, wanted, was to try to turn this country into Denmark. As soon as you were mentioning that, I was thinking of how we should do this, and to some degree, effectively, I think the Trump administration, Pompeo did this with the Iraqis on a bright moment of success in 2019, 2020, where we gave them a lot of demands and said, we're just going to pull out and give you no support. You're on your own if you don't ratchet back on the Iranians. That's how we got the new prime minister and a few other things positive. Killing Qasem Soleimani and Mohandas didn't hurt either, frankly. But that, of course, was not sustained. I think that there was, what we would have had to have done is say, okay, we're going to go in and take these ISIS guys out, but here's the 20 things you're going to do. And even before this judge, I had Judge Midhat, who was also tilting towards Maliki, and all kinds of other things. This is how you're going to fix your country. And the Iraqis would have objected. All kinds of people, including our European friends, who were beginning by 2015 to feel the impact of the Islamic State in a way we weren't, would have started screaming. And we would have just said, wait a second, we've seen this movie, we're not good at this. How are we going to do this? I don't think, as I said, and I'm partially contradicting myself, because what Pompeo did was give the Iraqis 8 specific things to do. They did about half of them, and it was kind of good enough to continue on. But it is very hard, given both the powerful force of Iran in these states and the powerful countervailing force of Islamic Sunni jihadist terror. It's very hard for us to figure out a secret sauce that, as I said, turns these countries into Denmark, because Denmark doesn't have an Iranian problem or a Al-Qaeda problem. I just don't know how we would have done it.
Not yet.
Yeah, not yet.
Joel, did you want to add something?
Well, I never thought we were trying to turn Iraq into Denmark. I thought my feeling was we should just try to turn Iraq into Iraq. And so I thought, my sense inside the military, by the time you got to 2010, 11, 12, that there were no longer dreams of perfecting the Iraqi system of governance. At that point, it was mainly just about trying to staunch the bleeding and stabilize the place, which we then proceeded not to do. But yet the response, there was an overlearning, still is, of the lessons of the collapse of the Iraqi state in 2003. And that there's been a revulsion for 20 years, not just to nation building, but essentially just having a political strategy at all to further U.S. interests in these places. Afghanistan is case in point. Syria mostly is the same. And in that context, the U.S. government made a decision early on to respond to the ISIS to the ISIS problem without any political strategy at all, and just to start zapping Sunnis from the air ad infinitum. And I can tell you, if that's what you're doing, if you decide you're gonna approach a problem which is political by nature, ISIS exists in the context of a political war that has been raging across the northern Middle East for a long time, and it gets its oxygen from the political conflict. And if you're not going to have a strategy to address the root political conflict, and you decide you're going to zap Sunnis from the air, you will be zapping Sunnis from the air forever. And that's where we are right now. In addition to, the U.S. military, in a technical sense, enjoys zapping Sunnis from the air because we're good at zapping Sunnis from the air. We like it. It's easy. It's because they don't have an air force, they don't have air defense, and we can just zap. When we find them, we can zap them. But if you don't address the political source of that phenomenon, then there'll just be another one and another one and another one and
It's
another one.
remarkable. This is the conversation we're having about Asia right now, right? Which is that we over-militarize in the absence of a political strategy. This gentleman, extraordinarily patient and gracious. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Samir Al-Taki. I used to be heading a Center for Strategic Studies in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Syria at the time. And now I left Syria even before the Syrian uprising, after a clash with Bashar al-Assad. So let me tell my side of the story of how we were seeing you in Iraq. I did have lots of debate with American diplomats that had been on WikiLeaks about that we think that Iraq will collapse because you are not entering for nation building. We did have discussions about hanging Saddam Hussein, thing you didn't do to the Japanese emperor. The same, so going further, it was very obvious in Damascus. The whole debate here now that has come out is that you are thinking that Iraq is an hermetic place. It's not within a context of a regional, communicating vessels all over the country, all over the region, that really exchange waves of politics, fighters, etc., all over. And it's about this game. And nothing had been mentioned about this issue. How the American withdrawal from Iraq, what was the impact on the general stability of the whole region? And this is very important in terms to whom are we delegating after hanging Saddam Hussein. I know he deserved to be hanged, of course, but at the end of the day, what we had done in this. So my big question now, after what's going on in the whole region, especially the Iranian-Saudi reconciliation, the Chinese, the Saudi-American reconciliation a bit, there are some movement in this direction. I think we are heading toward a new phase, maybe new wars. And I think here, what's lacking in the whole debate is the regional context. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, guys.
I agree. We feel at two separate things. It's important to, and you mentioned both, it's important to discriminate between the two. One is having an overall regional policy. Again, I've already gotten some pushback from Donnie, but I would say we're much better at that now in Europe and Asia. And traditionally, we've been much better at that in Europe and Asia because we deal with the states as they are. It's not so much the internal composition of the Philippines and Thailand, with the exception of Vietnam, and Taiwan and Korea. It's the geopolitical positioning of them. And when we want to, we can be good. We've not been very good in the Middle East, beginning with threats number 1 and 2, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and other such movements, and Iran. The second thing is, and it's a very different level, it means where we do care about the internal structure. And let me tell you how we're good at that. We did a really good job in Germany. My wife, who's German's sister, lives in a little town called Bensheim. Charming place on the romantic road between Heidelberg and Frankfurt, but not very big. In 1945, it was ruled by a former infantry sergeant by the name of Henry Kissinger. And there were Henry Kissingers who could speak German better than the head of the local school in every tiny little town in Germany. And there was money pouring in. Years later, when I was living at the consulate in Munich, the building I was living in, a sort of apartment building, was built with American taxpayers' money right after World War II, then handed to the Germans for ownership, and then we started paying a rent on it. This is the degree that we got involved to actually change Germany, with a lot of help from the Germans. The Iranians are doing that. They're all over the country. They have tremendous...
And Syria,
Pardon?
and Syria, and Lebanon, and.
And they know, they have people who speak beautiful Arabic. Hundreds, thousands of them, what am I talking about? They don't have PhDs, and a few of them do get picked off occasionally by the Islamic State guys, but they're traveling around there looking like and mingling with the population. To maintain 4 political offices out of my operation, my consulate, as we called it, after the military left in Basra, I needed 900 people. 600 of them, one or another degree involved with security, just to keep 4 political offices out on the street, and they all support mechanisms, because we couldn't say, okay, guys, go in and, go to the local shawarma shops to eat. Go to the local hospital for your medical care. We had to create like we were on the moon.
Yeah.
And we still do that, by the
And
way.
we still do that.
We still do that. Joel, did you want to say something quick?
Well, we never accounted for the role of the Assad regime in Iraq, and we never accounted for the role of the Iranian regime in Iraq. In fact, local commanders and ambassadors were kind of left to fend for themselves. There was never a concerted effort to deter the Iranian regime and the Assad regime from intervening to destabilize the new Iraqi government or what we were trying to accomplish. We never did it. And it was akin to, World War II is a success story for the Allies, but there were a lot of questions on which the U.S., the UK, and Russia could not agree, and it was left to General Eisenhower to mitigate and adjudicate things at a theater level in the absence of political guidance. And that characterized the entire time that we were in Iraq, and I think still does actually, is the guy on the ground, or the people, now the woman on the ground, is left to just handle and mitigate these problems to which Washington never even tries to formulate a strategic answer.
Jake Sullivan gave a speech at the Washington Institute on Middle East policy, and he's like the smartest, savviest, and most independent thinking of this whole gang. Nonetheless, he touted Iraq as a huge success
For Obama.
for the Biden foreign policy, and currently, everything Joel just said is correct about why it isn't. And he mentioned Iran for the first time at minute 22 of the speech on U.S. Middle East policy. We have a problem with exactly what you're talking about, is dealing at the geostrategic level. I mean, that's easier as a practitioner than getting down at the village level and getting people to use miracle rice. That's a lot harder, because you got to do a lot of villages at the same time. But even doing the geopolitical stuff, the diplomacy 101 stuff, we're terrible at.
I want to say something good about us, and I want to go to our last question on my little laptop thing that makes me look like my mom. We are terrible at this stuff, but we have better intentions than anybody else.
Well, that's true.
Right. And that's what distinguishes us. And we suck less than everybody else at doing things. We still suck, but we suck a lot less and give a lot more in the service of good values and good politics and our beliefs than anyone else. So Iraq is not a great success story, but Iraq under Saddam Hussein would have been a hell of a lot more of a miserable place. Okay, now, my nemesis, the guy who's literally the guy whose extension at the Congressional Research Service I still remember, is hunting me to this day and has a question from Ken Katzman.
Oh, no.
Senior fellow at the Soufan Group.
He's haunted me for years, too.
I hope you're watching, Ken. Why did the Bush administration ignore all the warnings by Iraq experts before the invasion, that would not include me then, that the invasion would end up empowering Iran as the preponderant influence in Iraq? Okay, who's going to take this home?
Joel is the historian of the Iraq War. I didn't stumble into it until 2004.
Oh, okay.
I was a mere major when the Iraq, no one
I
cared
think it was
what
my fault.
no one
then.
cared what Major Rayburn thought, and I wasn't. Strangely, I wasn't asked by President Bush what I thought. Not that I thought anything, but there was an assumption. There was an assumption, I think, that the Syrian regime and the Iranian regime would not dare to intervene in Iraq, and I also think that the mechanisms that they had already to reach into Iraq, especially the Iranian regime, was just unknown. It was a black box to us. So from an early stage, the Quds Force was in there with Iraqi proxies, Abu Mehdi al-Mohandes, Dagher Moussawi, and 20 others like them. We had no idea who they were. I mean, Abu Mehdi al-Mohandes was elected to parliament in 2005. So we went in on that score, on both the Syrian regime side and the Iranian regime side, pretty blind.
In defense, I'll get back to what you just said, because I actually was involved with it before 2004. I'm just hiding the links. Look, Saddam Hussein was a huge problem. We didn't invent that problem.
Yeah.
And we were running out of options. Smart sanctions weren't working. There was a new oil line that was being set up through Syria. He was challenging us every day, shooting at Northern Watch and Southern Watch airplanes, and on and on and on and on. It was a constant drain on our entire Middle East and overall foreign policy resources. So the idea that you had to do something and screw all the advisors saying, worry about this group, worry about Iran, worry about, we got to go do something.
If we worried about everything, we would never do anything.
Yeah,
But,
and
however, Ken's question, though, I think, is a question that belongs about 15 years in the past. Because I think the received opinion about the Iraq conflict, which is now 20 years old, because it's still going on, is that the current state of affairs, whenever it is an outcome that flows uninterruptedly from the Bush administration's decision to invade in early 2003. But there have been many, many, many decision points since then. And what happens is that some of the people who made good decisions aren't credited, but the many people who made bad decisions aren't held accountable because they're able to just point back, Bush, 2003. So the entire withdrawal, I think that the horrible state of affairs in Iraq owes much more to the decision to pull the plug on the U.S. mission in Iraq, not just the military mission, but also all the things that the diplomatic mission was supposed to inherit, than from the invasion of Iraq.
And to let Maliki win that election that he lost.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So Gary and I wrote a piece, which I recommend to every one of you, and this is our last word here, about the 5 decisions that in fact took us to where we are in Iraq for the American prospect. If anyone wants to read it, just email me. I'll send it to you. You can join my family in reading it. Thank you, guys. Thank you so very much. You really were. And thank you to all of you who have been here and who've contributed. We've really, I thought this is one of the most interesting things that we've done, and I'm so grateful to everybody who's been a part of it, and to all of you who were a part of it as well. Thank you, and thank you to Clara, who put up with me throughout all of this and did such fine work. So with that, we are done. Thank you, gentlemen.